The day my parents told me I wasn't welcome in their home anymore, I stood in our driveway watching my father throw my hastily packed suitcase into the trunk of my beat-up Honda Civic. 10 years later, they're calling me in tears about losing the very house they kicked me out of. Funny how family comes first only seems to matter when they need something from me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never imagined my graduation day would end with me homeless. Yet there I was, 18 years old, my high school diploma still fresh in my hands, listening to my father's voice grow colder than I'd ever heard it. "You have until Sunday to get your things and leave," Dad said, his arms crossed firmly over his chest as Mom stood silently beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line. "If you're going to throw away everything this family has built for you, you can do it somewhere else." I stared at them, still wearing the dress I'd picked for the graduation party they'd thrown me just hours earlier. The backyard was still decorated with blue and white balloons, a half-eaten sheet cake sitting on the patio table. The words, "Congratulations, Jessica," were written in blue icing, now melting in the June heat. "I'm not throwing anything away," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound confident. "I just want to study architecture instead of business. It's my life." Mom shook her head, disappointment etched across her face. "We've planned everything for you, Jessica. Your spot in the family business, taking over when your father retires." Kyle understood his responsibility. "Why can't you?" My brother Kyle had followed the Morgan family plan perfectly. Business degree, married by 25, 2 perfect kids, and now at 32, he was being groomed to eventually take over Morgan Home Goods, our family's small chain of retail stores. And I was supposed to join him, to be his right-hand person, keeping everything in the family as Dad always emphasized. But I'd had different dreams since I was 12, sketching building designs in my bedroom while everyone else was asleep. Architecture wasn't just a whim, it was the only future I could imagine for myself. "The scholarship to Portland State is a full ride," I explained for what felt like the 100th time. "This is an opportunity I can't pass up." "Then you'll be passing up your place in this house," Dad replied, his voice firm but eerily calm. "Family comes first, Jessica. Always has, always will. If you're choosing something else, you're choosing to do it on your own." I thought he was bluffing. Parents say things when they're angry, when they're disappointed. They don't actually kick their children out over college majors, except mine did. 3 days later, I stood in our driveway watching my father throw my hastily packed suitcase into the trunk of my beat-up Honda Civic, the car I'd saved for by working weekends at the mall. Mom watched from the porch, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, despite the warm summer air. "You're making a mistake," she called out. "When you realize that, when you're ready to be part of this family again, you know what you need to do." What I needed to do, apparently, was abandon my dreams and fall in line. Kyle stood in the doorway behind her, my young nephews Ethan and Zoe peering around his legs, confusion on their little faces. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I slammed. The trunk shut and got into the driver's seat, surprised that I wasn't crying. Maybe the shock hadn't worn off yet. Or maybe, somewhere deep down, I'd always known this moment would come. The moment when I had to choose between who my parents wanted me to be and who I actually was. "Family comes first," Dad repeated, his final words to me before I backed out of the driveway. I had exactly $1,472 in my savings account, 3 suitcases of belongings, and nowhere to go. The dorms wouldn't open for another 2 months. My best friend Olivia's parents took me in for those first few weeks, setting up their basement guest room with fresh linens and a small desk. I found work at a local coffee shop, picked up extra shifts as a restaurant hostess on weekends, and started looking for a cheap apartment near campus. For the first month, I jumped every time my phone rang, hoping it was them calling to apologize, to tell me to come home. But the only Morgan who reached out was Uncle Warren, my dad's younger brother who had always been the black sheep of the family himself. "Give them time," he said when we met for coffee in August. "Rob's always been stubborn, and Patty follows his lead." "They kicked me out over a college major," I said, still unable to wrap my head around it. Uncle Warren sighed. "It's not just about your major, Jess. It's about control. Your father built that business from nothing. In his mind, keeping it in the family is his legacy. When you chose something else, he took it personally." "And Mom just went along with it," I said bitterly. The betrayal from her hurt more somehow. She'd always been the mediator, the peacemaker. "Your mother has never gone against your father's decisions, not once in 30 years of marriage," Uncle Warren said with a shrug. "Don't wait for her to start now." He slipped me an envelope before he left. Inside was $2,000 in cash and a note that said, "For your new start. This doesn't make up for anything, but I'm proud of you." That money helped me secure a tiny studio apartment near campus, where I spent the next 4 years working multiple jobs while maintaining the GPA needed to keep my scholarship. I lived on ramen and coffee, pulled all-nighters drafting building designs, and slowly built a life that was entirely my own. I tried reaching out exactly once, 6 months after I left. I called on Christmas morning, heart in my throat. "Morgan, residence," Mom answered, her voice bringing an unexpected wave of homesickness. "Mom? It's me. It's Jessica." A pause. Then her voice softened just slightly. "Jessica, Merry Christmas," I said, suddenly feeling foolish. I wanted to call and see how everyone is doing." "We're all together for Christmas dinner," she said pointedly. "Your brother and Vanessa brought the kids over early to open presents." The emphasis on all together wasn't lost on me. All together, except me. "That's nice," I said weakly. "Mom, I was thinking maybe we could talk. I know Dad's still angry, but—" "Your father isn't angry, Jessica," she interrupted. "He's disappointed. We both are. You chose to walk away from your family." My grip tightened on the phone. I didn't walk away. I was thrown out. Another pause. I could hear holiday music playing in the background, the sound of my niece and nephew laughing. "You know how to come home," Mom finally said. "When you're ready to be part of this family again, when you're ready to take your place in the business, like your brother has, we'll welcome you back with open arms." I ended the call shortly after, curled up on my secondhand futon, and cried until I had nothing left. That was the last time I reached out. Life went on. I graduated with honors, landed an entry-level position at Horizon Designs, one of Portland's most prestigious architectural firms, and slowly climbed my way up. I met Michael Chen at a colleague's housewarming party, a software engineer with kind eyes and a quiet confidence that drew me in immediately. 2 years later, we moved in together, creating the warm, supportive home I'd been missing. I still got updates about my parents and Kyle through Uncle Warren. The business was struggling a bit with the rise of online shopping. Kyle and Vanessa had bought a big house in Lake Oswego. My niece and nephew were growing up fast. My parents still didn't mention my name. And then, 10 years after that day in the driveway, my phone rang on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office at Horizon, reviewing plans for a new sustainable apartment complex, when an unknown number flashed across my screen. "Jessica Morgan," I answered professionally. "Jess? It's Kyle." I nearly dropped the phone. My brother and I hadn't spoken directly in a decade. Uncle Warren had mentioned that Kyle had tried to convince our parents to reach out over the years, but he'd never made the effort himself. "Kyle," I said flatly, "this is a surprise." "I know, I'm sorry." His voice sounded tired, strained. Nothing like the confident big brother I remembered. "I wouldn't call if it wasn't important." A familiar bitterness rose in my throat. Let me guess. Something's wrong and suddenly you remembered I exist. It's Mom and Dad, he continued, ignoring my sarcasm. They're about to lose the house. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment. And this concerns me how exactly? Kyle let out a heavy sigh. The business has been struggling for years. Dad took out a second mortgage to keep it afloat, then a third. They're 3 months behind on payments, and the bank is moving forward with foreclosure. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, surprised to find I actually meant it. Whatever my feelings toward my parents, I wouldn't wish homelessness on anyone. But I'm not sure what you expect me to do about it. They need money, Jess. A lot of it. I let out a sharp laugh. You have got to be kidding me. They kick me out at 18, don't speak to me for a decade, and now they want my money? I've helped as much as I can, Kyle said, sounding defensive. But with the kids' private school tuition and the payments on our house, so you thought you'd call your estranged sister who put herself through college working 3 jobs. My voice was rising now, drawing concerned glances from co-workers through my office's glass walls. I turned my chair toward the window. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You're doing well, Jess. Everyone knows Horizon is one of the top firms in the state, and Mom and Dad are getting older. Dad's got health issues now, and stop, I cut him off. Just stop. I haven't heard from any of you in 10 years. 10 years, Kyle. Not a call on my birthday, not a card when I graduated, not a single word when I got promoted. And now you want what? For me to write a check to save the house I was thrown out of? The line was quiet for so long I thought he might have hung up. They were wrong, he finally said, his voice so low I barely caught the words. What they did to you was wrong, Jess. I know that. I've always known that. Something caught in my chest, a decade of hurt suddenly fresh again. Then why didn't you ever say anything? I whispered. Why didn't you ever call? I was a coward, he admitted. I didn't want to rock the boat. I had Vanessa and the kids, and the business, and I took the easy way out. I'm sorry. I stared. Out the window at the Portland skyline, buildings I'd dreamed about designing as a girl. Buildings I now helped create because I'd refused to give up that dream. How much do they need? I heard myself asking. $60,000 to get caught up on the mortgage and property taxes. More to actually save the business, but the house is the immediate concern. $60,000. It wasn't an impossible sum for me now. Michael and I had been saving for a down payment on our own house, plus my recent promotion had come with a substantial raise. But it was the principle of the thing. Have they even asked about me? Once in 10 years? Kyle hesitated. They have your old room exactly like you left it. Something about that detail made my throat tighten. That's not what I asked. They're too proud, Jess, but they need you. I thought about the 18-year-old girl packing her life into a Honda Civic. The nights I'd cried myself to sleep, in my cramped studio apartment. The graduations and birthdays and holidays spent alone or with friends who'd become my chosen family. I'll think about it, I finally said. Jess, they don't have much time. The foreclosure. I said I'll think about it, I repeated firmly. That's all I can offer right now. After we hung up, I sat motionless, staring at the phone in my hand. 10 years of silence, and now this. I thought I'd processed all my anger, all my hurt. I thought I'd moved on. But as I drove home that evening, I realized I'd never truly dealt with the abandonment. I just buried it under achievements and forward momentum. And now, in one phone call, it was all rushing back. Michael found me sitting on our balcony that night, a glass of wine untouched beside me. Tough day? He asked, sliding into the seat next to mine. When I told him about Kyle's call, he listened without interrupting, his hand finding mine in the growing darkness. "What do you want to do?" he asked when I finished. "Part of me wants to tell them to figure it out themselves," I admitted. "After everything they did, why should I help them now?" Michael nodded. "That would be understandable. But another part—" I trailed off, struggling to articulate the confused emotions swirling inside me. "Wants to help anyway," he finished. "For me." I looked at him gratefully. "Is that crazy, after how they treated me?" "It's not crazy," he said gently. "It's human. They're still your parents, Jess. And helping them doesn't mean you're saying what they did was okay." I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching the city lights flicker on across Portland. "What would you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think I'd want to see them first, face to face, before making any decisions." The thought made my stomach churn with anxiety. 10 years was a long time. In my mind, they were frozen as they had been that day, disappointed, judgmental, unyielding. But they would be older now. My dad with health problems, according to Kyle. "I think you need closure," Michael continued. "Whether that means helping them or not, you need to look them in the eye again." I knew he was right. Whatever I decided, I couldn't make this decision based on decade-old memories and secondhand information from Kyle. That night, I lay awake long after Michael had fallen asleep, remembering moments from my childhood. My dad teaching me to ride a bike, his strong hands steadying the seat until I found my balance. My mom bandaging scraped knees, pressing gentle kisses to make the pain go away. Family dinners where we talked about our days, weekend trips to the coast, the safety I'd once felt in that house. Where had it all gone wrong? Had I really thrown away my place in the family as they claimed? Or had they thrown me away because I refused to be the person they wanted? The next morning, I called Kyle back. "I'll come see them," I said without preamble. "This weekend, but I'm not promising anything." "Thank you," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. "Should I tell them you're coming?" I considered this. Part of me wanted to catch them off guard, to see their authentic reaction to my presence after all this time. But surprising them felt somehow cruel. "Yes," I decided. "Tell them." Saturday, at noon. As I ended the call, a notification popped up on my phone, a reminder of a meeting with contractors for the new apartment complex project. Life continuing as normal. Even as I prepared to revisit the past I'd spent a decade trying to outrun. I had 3 days to figure out what I was going to say to the parents who had once told me family comes first, right before proving that I wasn't family at all. The drive to Beaverton felt longer than the 20 minutes it actually took. Each mile brought back memories I thought I'd buried years ago, passing the high school where I'd graduated with honors, the park where we'd had family picnics, the shopping center where our first Morgan Home Goods store had opened when I was just a kid. I'd avoided this part of town for years, building my new life in downtown Portland as if the suburbs where I grew up existed in another dimension entirely. Michael had offered to come with me, but this was something I needed to do alone. "Call me if you need backup," he'd said as I left our apartment that morning, squeezing my hand in that reassuring way of his. I'd nodded, too nervous to say much. As I turned onto the familiar street, my stomach tightened. The neighborhood looked mostly the same. Tidy houses with well-kept lawns, basketball hoops in driveways, an occasional tricycle or scooter left on a front walk. My parents' house, though, was immediately noticeable for how different it appeared. The once immaculate lawn was patchy and overgrown. The blue paint on the trim had faded and was peeling in places. The flower beds my mother had maintained with religious devotion were now just bare soil with a few struggling perennials. I parked on the street, taking a moment to compose myself before getting out. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed a woman I barely recognized in moments like this, Confident, professional, successful. Nothing like the terrified 18-year-old who had pulled away from this house a decade ago. Kyle's SUV was already in the driveway. Of course he would be here, probably to smooth things over or make sure the conversation didn't go off the rails. Always the diplomat, my brother. Always the peacemaker who somehow never managed to stand up for me when it counted. I checked my watch. Exactly noon. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my car and walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. Before I could even knock, it swung open. Jessica. My mother stood in the doorway, her hand clutching, the frame as if for support. The sight of her hit me like a physical blow. She had aged more than I'd expected. Her once dark hair now completely silver, new lines etched around her eyes and mouth. Her shoulders slightly stooped in a way I didn't remember. For a moment, neither of us moved. "Hi, Mom," I finally managed, my voice steadier than I felt. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, please." The house smelled the same, that peculiar mix of cinnamon potpourri, furniture polish, and the faint woody scent that had always permeated our home. But like the exterior, the inside showed signs of neglect. The hardwood floors needed refinishing. The family photos on the wall, all featuring Kyle, Vanessa, and their children now, were dusty. The furniture looked tired and worn. My father was sitting in his recliner in the living room, and the sight of him was even more shocking than my mother. Robert Morgan had always been a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that filled any room he entered. The man who looked up at me now seemed diminished somehow, thinner, grayer, the confident posture replaced by a slight hunch. But his eyes, those sharp blue eyes that could cut you to the quick with just a glance, were unchanged. "Jessica," he said, making no move to get up. Whether from physical inability or stubborn pride, I couldn't tell. "Dad." I nodded, remaining standing just inside the living room. Kyle hovered anxiously near the fireplace, his hands shoved into the pockets of his khakis. "Jess, thanks for coming," he said, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. 10 years of unspoken words hung in the air between us, making it hard to breathe. "Would you like some coffee?" Mom finally asked, her voice high and unnaturally bright. "I just made a fresh pot." "Sure," I said, grateful for the momentary reprieve. I followed her into the kitchen, leaving Kyle and Dad in a silence that seemed heavier than the one we'd just escaped. The kitchen, at least, was exactly as I remembered it. The vintage-inspired appliances, the sunny yellow walls, the window over the sink that looked out onto the backyard. Mom moved around the space with the familiarity of someone who had occupied it for decades, pulling mugs from the same cabinet, spoons from the same drawer. "You look good, Jessica," she said quietly as she poured the coffee. "Healthy." I accepted, the mug she handed me. "Thanks, I am." I hesitated, then added, "I'm doing well. At work, I mean, and in general." She nodded, her eyes darting to my face and then away again. "Kyle told us about your job at that architecture firm. You're successful then." There was something in her tone I couldn't quite place. Pride? Regret? Or just uncomfortable acknowledgement of a path she and Dad had opposed so vehemently? "Yes," I said simply. "I am." We returned to the living room with our coffee. I took a seat on the couch opposite Dad's recliner, setting my mug on a coaster on the coffee table. Some habits never die, even after a decade away. "Well," Dad said, breaking the silence, "this is quite a reunion." The undercurrent of bitterness in his voice wasn't lost on me. I sat up straighter, squaring my shoulders. "Kyle called me," I said, deciding to get straight to the point. "He said you're about to lose the house." Dad shot Kyle a look that could have frozen lava. We're having some temporary financial difficulties, he said stiffly. Nothing we can't handle. Dad, Kyle interjected, we agreed to be honest about the situation. Mom placed a hand on Dad's arm. Robert, please. Dad's jaw worked for a moment. The stubborn pride I remembered so well wrestling with whatever desperation had led them to allow Kyle to contact me in the first place. The business has been struggling, he finally admitted, each word seeming to cause him physical pain. The big box stores, online shopping, it's been hard to compete. We've had to close 3 locations in the past 5 years, Mom added. We're down to just the original store now. I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee to give myself a moment to process. Uncle Warren had mentioned the business was having trouble, but I hadn't realized the extent of it. Kyle said you took out multiple mortgages on the house to keep the business afloat, I prompted when neither of them continued. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his recliner. We had to. The business has been in this family for 30 years. We couldn't just let it die. And now you're 3 months behind on payments, I continued, and the bank is moving forward with foreclosure. Mom's eyes filled with tears. We've tried everything, Jessica. Refinancing, payment plans. But without an infusion of capital? She trailed off, leaving the obvious conclusion unspoken. So, you need money, I said flatly. And Kyle suggested, You ask me? Dad's face darkened. This wasn't my idea. Dad, Kyle warned. What? Dad snapped. Am I supposed to pretend this isn't humiliating? Having to ask for help from... He cut himself off, but the unsaid words hung in the air. From the daughter who defied us. From the daughter we kicked out. From the daughter who wasn't supposed to succeed without us. I set my coffee mug down carefully, fighting to keep my voice even. From the daughter you threw away when she was 18 because she wanted to follow her own path instead of yours? Jessica, Mom began, her voice pleading. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, I said, looking her directly in the eyes. You told me family comes first, and then made it clear I wasn't family unless I did exactly what you wanted. You abandoned your responsibility to this family, Dad said, his voice rising. We gave you everything, a good home, education, opportunities, and you threw it back in our faces to chase some pipe dream. Some pipe dream? I repeated incredulously. I'm a senior architectural engineer at one of the most prestigious firms in the state. I design buildings that will stand for generations. Is that what you call a pipe dream? Robert, please, Mom interjected. We didn't ask Jessica here to argue about the past. No, I agreed, feeling a strange calm descend over me. You asked me here because you need my money. The money I earned from that pipe dream you were so quick to dismiss. The room fell silent. Again. Kyle stared at the floor, unwilling to meet my eyes. Mom twisted her hands in her lap. And Dad looked away, the muscle in his jaw twitching. $60,000, I said after a moment. That's what Kyle said you need to save the house. Dad nodded stiffly, still not looking at me. Before I even consider helping, I continued, I need to understand exactly what happened. How you got to this point. And I need to see everything. Mortgage statements, business financials, all of it. This is still our private business, Dad began, but Mom cut him off. Robert, we're not in a position to refuse. She turned to me. Of course we'll show you everything, Jessica. Kyle moved to a cabinet near the dining room, pulling out a thick folder. I've already gathered most of the documents, he said, bringing them over and setting them on the coffee table between us. Tax returns for the past 5 years, mortgage statements, business profit and loss statements. I raised an eyebrow at him. You came prepared. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I figured you'd want to know what you might be getting into. I opened the folder and began scanning the documents, years of financial training from my own budgeting and investing allowing me to quickly grasp the situation. It was worse than I'd imagined. The business had been hemorrhaging money for years. Dad had taken increasingly desperate measures to keep it afloat, maxing out credit cards, taking cash advances, and finally, putting the family home at risk. "This is a disaster," I murmured, more to myself than to them. "The market changed," Dad said defensively. "We've been selling home goods the same way for 30 years. It worked before." I looked up from the papers. "But it doesn't work anymore. Surely you could see that from these numbers. Why keep throwing good money after bad?" Dad's face flushed. "That business is my legacy. Your grandfather started it with nothing but determination and hard work. I wasn't going to be the one to let it die. So instead, you're going to lose the house?" I shook my head in disbelief. "The house where Kyle and I grew up? The house you've lived in for what, 35 years? "We didn't have a choice," Mom said quietly. "There are always choices," I replied, closing the folder. "But sometimes they're hard ones." I leaned back on the couch, studying my parents. They looked so much older, so much more vulnerable than the stern, unyielding figures who had stood in this very room and told me I was no longer welcome. Part of me, a part I wasn't particularly proud of, felt a grim satisfaction seeing them, brought low like this, needing help from the daughter they'd discarded. But another part just felt sad. Sad for all the years lost, sad for the relationship we might have had, sad for the pain that pride and stubbornness had caused on all sides. "I need to think about this," I finally said. "This is a lot to take in." "The bank has given us 30 days, Kyle said. "After that, they'll start formal foreclosure proceedings." I nodded, standing up. "I understand the timeline. I'll let you know my decision within the week." Dad looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "And if you decide not to help, what then?" The challenge in his voice made something inside me harden again. 10 years, and he still couldn't bring himself to simply ask for help, to acknowledge that he needed me. "Then I suppose you'll have to figure it out yourselves," I replied evenly, the way I had to when I was 18. Mom flinched as if I'd slapped her. Kyle let out a soft sigh. "Jessica," Mom began, rising from her seat, "before you go, would you like to see your room? We've kept it just as it was." The offer caught me off guard. I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." Mom led me upstairs, Kyle trailing behind us while Dad remained seated in his recliner. The second floor was just as I remembered, the creaky third, step, the faded wallpaper in the hallway, the small window at the end that looked out over the front yard. My childhood was embedded in every inch of this house, good memories and painful ones alike. Mom opened the door to my old bedroom, and I caught my breath. Kyle hadn't been exaggerating. It really was exactly as I'd left it. The pale blue walls, covered in architectural posters I'd carefully chosen. The twin bed with the patchwork quilt my grandmother had made. The desk where I'd spent countless hours sketching building designs and dreaming of a future my parents couldn't understand. "We didn't change anything," Mom said softly beside me. "Not one thing." I stepped inside, running my fingers over the spines of books on my shelf, touching the collection of glass paperweights I'd started as a child. It was like a museum exhibit of my 18-year-old self, preserved in amber while the girl it had belonged to grew into someone else entirely. "Why?" I asked, turning to face my mother. "Why keep it like this when you made it so clear I wasn't welcome back unless I changed everything about my plans, my dreams, myself?" Mom's eyes filled with tears again. "Because you're my daughter, Jessica. Whatever happened, you're still my daughter." The simple statement hit me harder than I expected. I turned away, blinking rapidly to keep my own emotions in check. "That's not what you said when I left," I reminded her, my voice low. "You said I knew what I needed to do to be part of this family again." "I was wrong," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. We were both wrong. I looked at her sharply, searching her face for signs of manipulation. But all I saw was exhaustion, regret, and fear. Fear of losing her home? Yes, but something else too. Fear of losing me all over again, perhaps. We should have supported your dreams, she continued, twisting her wedding band around her finger nervously. But your father was so set on keeping the business in the family, and after you left, it just became harder and harder to reach out. Pride is a terrible thing, Jessica. Yes, I agreed. It is. Kyle cleared his throat from the doorway. For what it's worth, I tried to get them to call you. Many times over the years, especially after Ethan was born, and then Zoe. I wanted them to know their aunt. I studied my brother's face. The golden child, the one who had done everything right according to our parents' standards. I'd resented him for so long, but standing here now, I could see the toll their expectations had taken on him too. The lines of stress around his eyes, the slight stoop to his shoulders that mirrored our father's. Kyle had paid a different price for staying, just as I had paid mine for leaving. Why didn't you ever call me yourself? I asked him directly. You knew where I was. Uncle Warren always knew how to reach me. Kyle looked down, shame evident in his posture. I was a coward, he admitted for the second time. I didn't want to get caught in the middle, and then as time went on, it just seemed harder to bridge that gap. I nodded, accepting his answer without absolving him. Turning back to the room, I noticed something on my desk I hadn't seen initially, a stack of newspaper clippings. Moving closer, I realized they were articles about Horizon Designs, about projects I'd worked on. My name was highlighted in each. Once, you kept track of me, I said, surprise evident in my voice. Mom nodded. Of course we did. You're our daughter. The contradiction was so stark, so absurd, that I almost laughed. They had kicked me out, refused to speak to me for a decade, and yet carefully collected evidence of my accomplishments like proud parents. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. I don't understand you, I said honestly. Any of you. We made a terrible mistake, Mom said, her voice breaking. And by the time we realized it, it seemed too late to fix it. I picked up one of the clippings, a feature in the Portland Business Journal about the sustainable apartment complex I was currently working on. It's never too late to admit you were wrong, I said quietly. But it's a lot harder when you only do it because you need something. Mom nodded, wiping away a tear. I know how this looks, reaching out now when we're in trouble. But please believe me, Jessica. I've regretted what happened every single day for 10 years. I wanted to believe her. Part of me did. But another part, the part that had cried herself to sleep in a strange bed after being thrown out of her home, remained skeptical. I'll think about the money, I said finally, setting the clipping back down. But I need to be clear about something. If I decide to help, it's not going to be a blank check. And it's not going to be without conditions. What kind of conditions? Kyle asked from the doorway. I turned to face them both. I don't know yet, but they'll involve actual change, not just temporary gratitude until the crisis passes. Mom nodded quickly. Of course, anything. I looked around my preserved bedroom one last time, then stepped toward the door. I should go. I have a lot to think about. We made our way back downstairs in silence. Dad was still in his recliner, his expression guarded as we returned to the living room. Jessica is going to think about it, Mom told him, her tone almost pleading. She'll let us know within the week. Dad nodded once, his pride clearly battling with his desperation. We appreciate you considering it, he said stiffly, the closest thing to gratitude I was likely to get. I gathered my purse, suddenly eager, to be out of this house that felt both achingly familiar and completely foreign at the same time. I'll be in touch, I said, heading for the door. Kyle followed me out to my car. Jess, wait, he called as I fumbled with my keys. There's something else you should know. I turned, raising an eyebrow. More bad news? He shook his head. It's Dad. His health issues. They're not just general aging. He had a mild heart attack 6 months ago. The doctor says the stress of the business failing, the potential for closure, it's not helping. I absorbed this new information, unsure how it was supposed to make me feel. Concerned, certainly. But also manipulated? Was this just another lever to pry open my checkbook? Is he following doctor's orders? Taking his medication? I asked. Kyle nodded. As much as he can afford to. Some of his prescriptions, well, they're expensive, and with everything else. So you're saying if I don't help and they lose the house, the stress might kill him, I summarized bluntly. Kyle winced. I'm not trying to guilt you, Jess. You asked for all the information, and this is part of it. That's all. I sighed, leaning against my car. This is a lot, Kyle. I know. He hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. Here, before you go. It was a small, worn photograph. I took it, turning it over in my hands. It showed our family at the beach, Mom, Dad, Kyle, and me, maybe 12 years old, all smiling into the camera, windblown and sunburned and happy. A perfect moment frozen in time. I found it in an old album last week, Kyle explained. Remember that trip to the coast? When Dad taught us to fly kites and we stayed until sunset? I did remember. It had been one of those rare, perfect days, before teenage rebellions and college plans and expectations had begun to fracture our family bond. Keep it, I said, trying to hand it back. Kyle shook his head. I want you to have it. Just as a reminder that it wasn't all bad, that there was love there, beneath everything else. I slipped the photo into my pocket, unexpectedly touched by the gesture. I never said there wasn't love, Kyle. That's what made it hurt so much when they chose their expectations over that love. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. For what it's worth, I think they've had 10 years to realize what they lost. And I don't just mean your financial help now. I got into my car, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the past few hours. I'll call you, I promised. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Kyle stood on the sidewalk, watching me go. Behind him, 2 figures had appeared in the doorway of the house, Mom and Dad side by side, looking older and smaller than I remembered. The sight stirred something complicated inside me, a tangle of anger and resentment, and grief, and despite everything, a stubborn thread of love that had survived 10 years of silence. The drive back to Portland gave me time to process everything I'd seen and heard. The failing business, the impending foreclosure, Dad's health issues, the preserved bedroom with its carefully collected clippings of my achievements. It was all so contradictory, so fundamentally messed up in a way that only families can be. By the time I reached our apartment, I had more questions than answers. Michael was waiting, a look of concerned curiosity on his face as I walked through the door. "How did it go?" he asked, pulling me into a hug I didn't realize how badly I needed. I sank into his embrace, breathing in the comforting scent of his cologne. It was complicated, I said finally, drawing back to look at him. Really complicated. Michael led me to the couch and I told him everything, the state of the house, the failing business, my parents' contradictory behavior, Kyle's revelation about Dad's heart attack, and the preserved room that made no sense alongside a decade of silence. "What are you thinking?" he asked when I finished, his hand warm around mine. "I honestly don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to help them because, well, they're still my parents, and I don't want them to be homeless. But another part feels like this is just another form of manipulation, reaching out only when they need something from me." "And you don't want to be used," Michael said, understanding as always. "Exactly." I leaned back against the cushions, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of the decision before me. But what kind of person would I be if I just turned my back on them? Would I be any better than they were? Michael considered this. I think there's a middle ground, Jess. You can help without being used. You can set boundaries while still being compassionate. What would that even look like? I wondered aloud. That's something only you can decide, he replied. But I think you already know you're going to help them, at least in some way. The question is how and on what terms. He was right, I realized. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the anger and the lost years, I couldn't simply walk away and leave them to lose their home. Not if I had the power to prevent it. But Michael was also right that I needed to protect myself, to ensure that any help I provided came with clear expectations and boundaries. I need to talk to someone who understands family businesses, I said, an idea beginning to form, and real estate, and possibly elder care options. Michael smiled, recognizing the shift in my tone from uncertainty to determination. You're formulating a plan. Maybe, I acknowledged. But first, I need more information. The next morning, I called in a favor from a colleague at Horizon who specialized in business valuation. I explained the situation in broad strokes, and he agreed to look over the Morgan Home Goods financial documents. I also reached out to a real estate agent friend to get her take on the current market value of my parents' house versus what they owed on it. By Friday afternoon, 3 days after my visit to Beaverton, I had a clearer picture of the situation, and it wasn't pretty. The business was essentially unsalvageable in its current form. Years of declining sales and increasing debt had created a hole too deep to climb out of. The house, at least, still had equity, despite the multiple mortgages. In fact, if they sold it and downsized, they could potentially clear their debts and have enough left for a modest condo or retirement community unit. The problem, as I well knew, was that my father would never willingly give up either the business or the house. Both represented something fundamental to his identity: the successful small business owner, the provider, the head of a traditional family in a traditional family home. Asking him to let go of either would be like asking him to cut off a limb. But maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. Sometimes amputation is the only way to save the patient. I picked up my phone and called Kyle. We need to meet, I told Kyle without preamble when he answered. All of us. Tomorrow morning at the house. Jess, have you decided? The hope in his voice was palpable. I have a proposal, I said carefully, but I need everyone to hear it together. 10 a.m. works for me. We'll be there, Kyle promised. Thank you, Jess. Really. I ended the call before he could say more. Gratitude felt premature given what I was about to propose. A solution that would help them financially, but would require my father to sacrifice something he valued almost as much as money: his pride. That night, I spread my notes across our dining table, reviewing figures and options while Michael cooked dinner. The smell of garlic and ginger filled our apartment as he prepared his mother's famous stir-fry, one of the many recipes he'd learned growing up in a Chinese-American household where food was the love language of choice. You know, he said, stirring vegetables in the wok, whatever you decide, I'm behind you 100%. I looked up from my papers with a grateful smile. Even if it means using part of our house down payment fund? He nodded without hesitation. Family is complicated, but it's still family. And this? He gestured to our apartment, to the life we'd built together. This isn't going anywhere. We can save up again. His unconditional support nearly brought me to tears. It was everything I hadn't had growing up. Acceptance without expectation, love without conditions. I don't deserve you, I said softly. Michael set down his wooden spoon and came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. Yes, you do, he said firmly. And for what it's worth, I think your plan makes sense. It helps your parents while protecting you. It's compassionate but not naive. I leaned back against him, drawing strength from his presence. I just hope they can see it that way. The next morning dawned bright and clear, one of those rare, perfect Portland spring days that makes you forget about the months of rain. I dressed carefully in a professional outfit, tailored navy slacks, a crisp white blouse, low heels, the kind of outfit I'd wear to present architectural plans to important clients. Because that's what this was in a way, a presentation of a plan designed to solve a problem, albeit a deeply personal one. Michael kissed me goodbye at the door. Call me when it's over? I nodded. Wish me luck. You don't need luck, he said with a confidence I wished I shared. You've got this. The drive to Beaverton felt different this time, less emotional, more purposeful. I wasn't going as the rejected daughter returning to face her past. I was going as Jessica Morgan, successful professional with a solution to offer. The distinction felt important. When I arrived, Kyle's SUV was already in the driveway as expected. What surprised me was the presence of another car I recognized, Uncle Warren's ancient but meticulously maintained Volvo. Inside, I found them all gathered in the living room, Mom and Dad in their usual spots, Kyle perched nervously on the edge of the sofa, and Uncle Warren standing near the fireplace, arms crossed over his chest. Jessica, Uncle Warren greeted me warmly, stepping forward to wrap me in a hug. Good to see you, kiddo. Uncle Warren? I returned the embrace, genuinely pleased to see him. I didn't expect you here. Kyle called me, he explained, shooting my brother a look I couldn't quite interpret. Thought it might be helpful to have a neutral party present. I raised an eyebrow at Kyle, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. I just thought, given the history, you thought you might need a mediator. I finished for him, not entirely offended by the assumption. Fair enough. I set my briefcase down on the coffee table and took a seat, conscious of all eyes on me. The atmosphere in the room was tense, with anticipation. Thank you for coming, Jessica, Mom began, her hands nervously smoothing her skirt. We appreciate you considering. Before we start, I interrupted gently, I want to be clear about something. I've spent the last few days looking over your financial documents and consulting with experts I trust. What I'm about to propose isn't just about the money. It's about finding a sustainable solution for everyone involved. Dad shifted in his recliner, a wary look crossing his face. What exactly does that mean? I took a deep breath. It means that if you want my help, things are going to have to change. Significantly. Dad's expression darkened, but before he could speak, Uncle Warren stepped in. Robert, just listen to what Jessica has to say. You're not in a position to dismiss any options right now. The blunt assessment from his younger brother seemed to temper my father's reaction. He settled back in his chair with a curt nod. Go on. I opened my briefcase and pulled out the folder I'd prepared, passing copies to each of them. First, let's be clear about where things stand. The business has been operating at a loss for 5 consecutive years. You've exhausted your business. Credit lines, maxed out personal credit cards, and put the house at risk with multiple mortgages. I paused, letting the stark assessment sink in before continuing. The current debt against the house is $342,000. The estimated market value, even in its current condition, is approximately $480,000. That leaves about $138,000 in equity, which is your largest remaining asset. Mom looked down at the papers. In her hands, her face pale. Dad remained stoic, but I could see the muscles in his jaw working. The business itself, I continued, has minimal value as an ongoing concern. The inventory is worth perhaps $60,000 at liquidation prices, and the lease on the retail space has 2 years remaining, which represents a liability rather than an asset given the current operating losses. Now wait just a minute, Dad interrupted, his voice tight with anger. That business supported this family for 30 years. It put food on the table, clothes on your back, a roof over your head. You can't just reduce it to numbers on a page. I met his gaze steadily. I'm not reducing your life's work to numbers, Dad. I'm acknowledging the financial reality we're facing. The retail landscape has changed dramatically, and Morgan Home Goods hasn't adapted. That's not a judgment. It's just a fact. Kyle cleared his throat. Jess is right, Dad. We've been having this conversation for years. The business hasn't turned a profit since before the pandemic. Dad glared at him. So what are you suggesting, Jessica? That I just close up shop? Abandon everything I've built? Everything your grandfather built? I'm suggesting, I said carefully, that we consider options that preserve what matters most while letting go of what's dragging you under. I turned to the second page of my presentation. I've put together 3 possible scenarios. The first is the status quo. You continue as you are, default on the mortgages, lose the house, and eventually have to close the business anyway when the remaining capital runs out. I think we can all agree that's not acceptable. No one disagreed. The second option is that I provide the $60,000 you need to bring the mortgages current. This buys you some time, but without addressing the underlying issues, you'll be in the same position 6 months from now. The business will continue to drain resources, and you'll still likely lose the house, just a bit later. Mom looked up, confusion and hope warring in her expression. And the third option? This was it, the proposal I'd spent days crafting, the one I knew would be hardest for them to accept. The third option is comprehensive restructuring, I said, deliberately using business terminology to create some emotional distance. It has several components. I outlined them methodically. First, we sell the house and use the equity to clear all outstanding debts. Second, we close Morgan Home Goods as a physical retail operation and transition any viable aspects to an online platform, which Kyle would manage as a side business if he's interested. Kyle's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but he didn't interrupt. Third, I continued, you relocate to a more manageable living situation. I've identified several very nice senior-oriented communities that would provide the comfort and security you need without the maintenance burden of this house. Dad's face was turning an alarming shade of red. You want us to move into an old folks' home? To give up everything? Dad, they're not old folks' homes, I said calmly. They're independent living communities with amenities designed for active seniors. And yes, I'm suggesting you let go of a house that's drowning you in debt and a business that's no longer viable. And where does your money come in? He demanded. Or is this just you telling us how to run our lives? Here was the part I knew would be hardest for him to swallow. I'm prepared to contribute $100,000, enough to cover the foreclosure prevention, and provide a cushion as you transition. But it would be an investment, not a gift. An investment? Mom echoed, clearly confused. Yes, I nodded. In exchange, I would become a partner in the restructured business, the online platform I mentioned, and I would hold a portion of equity in whatever new property you purchase to be transferred fully to you over time as certain conditions are met. The room fell silent. Uncle Warren was watching my father carefully, clearly braced for an explosion. Conditions, Dad finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. What kind of conditions? I took a deep breath. Financial transparency, regular family meetings, and I hesitated, then decided to just say it directly. And acknowledgement of the harm that was done when you kicked me out at 18. Dad's eyes narrowed. So, that's what this is about. Revenge, making us grovel for your help. No, Dad, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. It's about making sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. It's about rebuilding relationships on healthier terms. And it's about making sure that any financial help I provide actually leads to a sustainable solution, not just a temporary fix. I think it sounds reasonable, Kyle interjected, earning a glare from Dad. Of course you do, Dad snapped. You have nothing to lose here. Kyle flinched, but stood his ground. Actually, Dad, I have plenty to lose. My time, potentially, if I take on managing an online store. And my relationship with you if I agree with Jess and you decide that makes me disloyal somehow. I was surprised by Kyle's candor and touched by his support, however belated it might be. Robert, Mom said softly, placing her hand on his arm. Please, let's at least consider what Jessica is proposing. Dad shook his head. Consider giving up the house we've lived in for 35 years? Consider closing the business my father started with his own 2 hands? Consider letting our daughter dictate how we should live our lives in exchange for her money? No, Patricia. I won't consider it. Uncle Warren stepped forward. Rob, be reasonable. Jessica isn't trying to control you. She's trying to help you. Find a way out of a situation that's going to end badly no matter what if you don't make some significant changes. Dad looked around the room, his expression a mixture of anger and betrayal. So all of you agree with her? All of you think I should just give up everything I've worked for? No one is saying give up, I countered. I'm saying pivot, change strategies, adapt. The business world has transformed, Dad. The way people shop, the way they live, it's all different now. Holding on to the past isn't just financially unsustainable, it's denying the reality of the present. Easy for you to say, he muttered. You never valued what we built here. The accusation stung, but I refused to be baited into an emotional argument. I valued our family, Dad. I just wanted to build something of my own, too. That's why I'm here now, because despite everything, I still care about what happens to you and Mom. Mom's eyes filled with tears, and I saw a flicker of something in Dad's expression, perhaps the first crack in his rigid facade. The senior communities I've researched are really nice, I continued, softening my tone. They have gardens, social, activities, maintenance-free living. You'd have more time to enjoy your retirement instead of stressing about a failing business and a house you can't afford. Retirement, Dad scoffed. I never planned to retire. The business was supposed to be my legacy, something to pass down to the next generation. His eyes flicked briefly to Kyle, then away. Legacies come in many forms, Dad, I said gently. They don't have to be buildings or businesses. They can be values, lessons, relationships. He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in his eyes. And what would you know about legacy, Jessica? You've spent the last 10 years building your own life without a thought for what came before. I could feel the conversation veering into dangerous territory, old wounds threatening to reopen. But I was determined to stay focused on solutions, not rehash the past. I know that legacies are supposed to help the next generation, not burden them, I replied evenly. And right now, the legacy of Morgan Home Goods is debt and stress. Kyle cleared his throat. Dad, I think we should at least look at the senior living places Jess mentioned. Just look. No commitment. Dad's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then he turned to Mom. And what do you think, Patricia? Ready to throw away our home? Our life's work? Mom looked down at her hands, then up at me, then finally at Dad. I think I'm tired, Robert. Tired of lying awake at night wondering how we'll make the next mortgage payment. Tired of watching you work yourself to exhaustion, trying to save a business that maybe can't be saved. Her voice grew firmer as she spoke. And I'm tired of pretending that cutting our daughter out of our lives was anything but the biggest mistake we ever made. Dad stared at her, clearly shocked by her candor. In 35 years of marriage, I couldn't remember her ever directly contradicting him like this. The business can be saved, he insisted. But the conviction had leached from his voice. We just need time. A little more time and things will turn around. That's what you've been saying for 5 years, Dad, Kyle said quietly. It's not turning around. I watched my father carefully. His shoulders had begun to slump, the rigid posture giving way to something that looked unnervingly like defeat. For all his bluster, I realized he knew the truth. He had known it for a while, perhaps. He just couldn't bring himself to admit it. "Let me show you the places I've researched," I said gently, pulling up a tablet from my briefcase and passing it to Mom. "This one is just 2 miles from here, so you'd still be in the same neighborhood. And this one has a woodworking shop. I thought you might like, Dad." Mom scrolled through the images, a tentative interest dawning on her face. "They do look nice," she admitted. "Much nicer than I imagined." Dad refused to look at first, but curiosity eventually got the better of him. He peered over at the screen, his expression guarded. "The monthly fees include everything: utilities, maintenance, even some meals if you want them," I explained. "And with the equity from this house, you could purchase a unit outright and still have money left over for living expenses." "What about our things?" Mom asked, glancing around the living room at the furniture and mementos accumulated over decades. "You'd need to downsize, of course," I acknowledged. "But the most important things, the ones with real sentimental value, would come with you. And honestly, it might be freeing to let go of some of the excess." "Easy to say when you're not the one doing the letting go," Dad muttered, but there was less heat in his voice now. Uncle Warren, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up. "Rob, remember when Dad retired and sold his share of the hardware store? How worried he was that he was giving up his identity." Dad nodded reluctantly. "And remember how, 6 months later, he told us it was the best decision he ever made? That he wished he'd done it years earlier?" A ghost of a smile touched Dad's lips. "He did say that, didn't he?" "He did," Uncle Warren confirmed. "Because he finally had time for all the things he'd been putting off. Fishing, traveling with Mom, spoiling his grandkids. He found out there was more to life than that store, even though he'd poured his heart into it for 40 years. Dad was silent, staring down at his hands. I could almost see the internal struggle playing out behind. His eyes, pride versus pragmatism, stubbornness versus survival. "I'm not saying it would be easy," I said softly. "Change never is, but it could be a new beginning, not just an ending." "And what about the online part of the business?" Kyle asked, leaning forward with interest. "How would that work?" I turned. To him, grateful for the shift in focus. "With the right approach, we could salvage the most profitable product lines and offer them through an e-commerce platform. Lower overhead, wider reach. You've got the business background, and I've got connections with digital marketing specialists who could help set everything up." Kyle nodded thoughtfully. "I've actually suggested something similar before, but I shot it down." Dad finished for him. "Because that's not how Morgan Home Goods operates. Maybe it's time for Morgan Home Goods to evolve," I suggested. "To become something different but still valuable." Dad looked at me, really looked at me, for perhaps the first time since I'd walked back into their lives. "And you'd be part of this? This new version of the business?" "If you want me to be," I said carefully. "I don't have the time to run it day to day, but I could advise, invest, help with strategy. It could be a true family business again, just in a different form." Something shifted in Dad's expression. A softening, a gradual lowering of defenses. "And the other conditions you mentioned? The financial transparency and family meetings?" "Basic good business practices," I replied. "Regular meetings to discuss finances, strategy, any issues that arise. And yes, family meetings too. Not just about business, but to rebuild relationships. All of us, including Michael, and your grandchildren who barely know me." Dad frowned slightly at the mention of Michael, whom he'd never met. "This boyfriend of yours, partner," I corrected gently. "We've been together for 3 years. He's a software engineer, and he's one of the kindest, most supportive people I've ever known. You'd like him if you gave him a chance." Mom leaned forward. "We'd like to meet him, wouldn't we, Robert? And yes, Jessica, you should know your Niece and nephew, they're wonderful children. Dad didn't agree out loud, but he didn't contradict her either. Progress, of a sort. And the last condition? Dad asked, his voice carefully neutral. The acknowledgement you mentioned? I took a deep breath. This was the crux of it all, the hardest part, but the most necessary if we were ever to move forward. I need to hear you say that what happened 10 years ago was wrong, I said, looking directly at both of them. Not just financially unwise, or an unfortunate misunderstanding. Wrong? Morally wrong? I was 18 years old, and you made me homeless because I wanted to pursue a career in architecture instead of joining the family business. Mom flinched visibly. Dad's jaw tightened. You used to say family comes first, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside me. But when it came down to it, your expectations for my life came first. Not my happiness, not my dreams, and certainly not our family bond. Uncle Warren and Kyle were both very still, watching this exchange with wary attention. The tension in the room was palpable. We thought we were doing what was best, Mom said softly. We thought you were making a mistake. Maybe I was. I conceded. Maybe architecture would have been a disaster for me, but that wasn't your decision to make, and cutting me off completely wasn't a loving response, no matter how you justified it. Dad stood up abruptly, walking to the window with his back to the room. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared out at the front yard where Kyle and I had played as children. You were right, he finally said, his voice so low I almost didn't hear it. About the business, it's been failing for years. I just couldn't admit it, couldn't face that all those decades of work might end with me, that I might be the one to let down my father's legacy. He turned back to face us, and to my shock, there were tears in his eyes. And you were right about what we did to you, too. It was wrong, unforgivably wrong. The words hung in the air, words I had never expected to hear from my proud, stubborn father. I felt something shift inside my chest, a knot of tension beginning to unravel after being pulled tight for so long. We were wrong, Jessica, Mom echoed, reaching for my hand across the coffee table. So terribly wrong. Can you ever forgive us? I looked at their faces, aged by time and worry, marked by the strain of failing finances and failing health. These flawed human people who had raised me, loved me in their imperfect way, and then broken my heart. I don't know, I answered, honestly. Forgiveness might take time, but I'm willing to try to build something new, if you are. Dad nodded slowly, returning to his seat. This plan of yours, it would mean the end of everything I've worked for. No, I disagreed gently. It would mean transformation, not ending. The house becomes capital for your future security. The business evolves into something sustainable for the next generation. And our family... I hesitated, then finished. Our family has a chance to heal. Uncle Warren cleared his throat. I think Jessica's plan makes a lot of sense, Rob. It addresses the immediate crisis and creates a path forward that could work for everyone. Kyle nodded. I'm willing to take on the online business aspect. I've been wanting to try some new approaches for years. All eyes turned to Dad. In the end, we all knew this would be his decision. Mom wouldn't oppose him directly, not on something this fundamental. Despite his diminished health and finances, he was still the patriarch, the center around which our family had always orbited. Dad looked at each of us in turn, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes settled on me. When you left, he said slowly. Or rather, when we forced you to leave, I was so angry. Angry that you'd rejected what I thought was a gift, a secure future, a family legacy. I convinced myself you were being selfish, ungrateful. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But watching you now, seeing the woman you've become, the success, you've built on your own terms. I realize I was the selfish one. I wanted to control your future because it was easier than imagining a different path. Easier than adapting, like you said. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but blinked them back. It's not too late to adapt now, Dad. He nodded slowly. No, I suppose it's not. He looked down at the papers I'd prepared, then back, up at me. This senior living place with the woodworking shop. Could we look at it? Just look. No commitments yet. Of course, I agreed, relief flooding through me. We can tour it tomorrow if you'd like. And this online business idea, he turned to Kyle. You really think it could work? Kyle nodded eagerly. I do, Dad. We have loyal customers, good products. We've just been stuck in an outdated retail model. With Jess's investment and some modern marketing approaches, I think we could actually grow again. Dad absorbed this, then looked at Mom. Patricia? What do you think? Could you leave this house? Mom looked around the living room, her expression a mixture of nostalgia and weariness. This house has a lot of memories, good and bad. But it's just a building, Robert. Our family, our health, those are what matter. And if Jessica's plan gives us a chance at financial security and bringing our family back together, her voice wavered, then yes, I could leave this house. Dad took a deep breath, then extended his hand across the coffee table toward me. All right, Jessica, we'll try it your way. All of it. The house sale, the business restructuring, the family healing. I reached out and took his hand, feeling the familiar roughness of his palm, the slight tremor that hadn't been there 10 years ago. Thank you, Dad. And for the first time in a decade, he squeezed my hand back. The moment passed, and we all seemed to exhale collectively. Uncle Warren clapped his hands together once. Well, I think this calls for a celebration. Anyone hungry? I could go pick up some lunch. The mundane suggestion broke the emotional tension, and suddenly we were all discussing lunch options like a normal family, as if we hadn't just navigated a seismic shift in our relationships. As Uncle Warren and Kyle debated the merits of nearby sandwich shops, Mom moved to sit beside me on the couch. Your father won't say it directly, she said quietly, but he's proud of you, Jessica, of what you've accomplished. We both are. I nodded, not quite ready to accept that sentiment at face value, but willing to acknowledge it as a start. It's going to take time, Mom, for all of us. I know, she agreed, but we have time now, don't we? A second chance? I thought about the long road ahead, the practical challenges of selling the house, relocating my parents, restructuring the business, and the even more daunting emotional work of rebuilding trust, establishing new boundaries, learning to be a family again on different terms. Yes, I said finally, we have a second chance. Let's try not to waste it this time. As Uncle Warren headed out to pick up lunch and Kyle made a call to Vanessa to update her on the morning's developments, I stepped outside onto the front porch for a moment alone. The spring air was fresh and sweet, carrying the scent of someone's blooming jasmine down the street. I pulled out my phone and called Michael. How did it go? He asked immediately upon answering. I looked back at the house, the faded paint, the overgrown garden, the home that had shaped me in ways both good and bad. They agreed to everything. Seriously? Michael sounded as surprised as I felt. Even your dad? Even my dad, I confirmed. It wasn't easy and we've got a long road ahead, but they actually listened. They acknowledged what they did was wrong. And they're willing to try a new path forward. That's amazing, Jess. I'm really happy for you. For all of you. Would you want to come over? I asked impulsively. Uncle Warren is bringing lunch, and, well, it seems silly for you to meet my family for the first time at a house tour tomorrow. Are you sure? He asked cautiously. That's a lot of emotional territory to cover in one day. I thought about it for a moment. I'm sure. If we're really doing this, rebuilding our family, then you need to be part of it from the beginning. You're my family too, Michael. Then I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. I could hear the smile in his voice. As I ended the call, Dad appeared in the doorway behind me. He hesitated, then stepped out onto the porch. "Your young man is coming over?" he asked, having obviously overheard my side of the conversation. "Yes," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "I'd like you to meet him." Dad nodded, looking out at the street rather than at me. "Good. That's good." We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, both of us out of practice with normal father-daughter interactions. "Jessica," he finally said, his voice gruff, "I want you to know something." I waited, giving him the space to find his words. "When you left, when we made you leave, I kept telling myself you'd come back, that you'd realize your mistake and come home where you belonged." He shook his head ruefully. "Stubborn old fool that I am, I actually convinced myself that you needed to learn a lesson, and once you had, everything would go back to normal, and instead I built my own life." I said quietly, "Yes, you did." He nodded, a complexity of emotions crossing his weathered face. "And a damned good one from what I can see. Better than anything I could have planned for you." The admission clearly cost him something, and I recognized it for the olive branch it was. I had help, I acknowledged. Uncle Warren, good friends, and later, Michael. I wasn't entirely on my own, even if it felt that way sometimes. Dad turned to face me, fully. "I'm sorry, Jessica. For what we did, for the years we lost. I can't change the past, but I give you my word. I'll do better going forward, if you'll let me." The sincerity in his eyes caught me off guard. This wasn't the reluctant, cornered apology of a man backed into a financial corner. This was genuine remorse from a father who had finally recognized the depth of his mistake. "One day at a time, Dad," I said, feeling a tentative warmth spreading through the cold places in my heart. "We'll figure it out together." He nodded, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of the father I remembered from childhood. The one who had taught me to ride a bike, who had built me a treehouse, who had once been my hero before expectations and disappointments had come between us. "One day at a time," he agreed. Then, with a hint of his old humor, he added, "Starting with me not scaring off this Michael fellow when he arrives." I laughed, and after a moment's hesitation, Dad joined in, the sound rusty but real. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't healing, not completely. But it was a beginning, a foundation we could build on together. As we turned to go back inside, I realized something with sudden clarity. The title my father had always claimed, "That family comes first," wasn't the problem. The problem had been in how narrowly he'd defined both family and what it meant to put someone first. True family isn't about control or conformity. It's about support and acceptance. And putting someone first means honoring who they are, not who you want them to be. 10 years ago, I had been thrown out of this house because I didn't fit a narrow definition of family loyalty. Today, I was walking back in on my own terms, bringing with me a broader, healthier vision of what family could be. And somehow, against all odds, my parents were ready to embrace it. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. After that initial breakthrough meeting, we'd toured 2 senior living communities, with my father reluctantly admitting that the one with the woodworking shop was not entirely terrible. Mom had been more enthusiastic, especially after meeting a resident who shared her passion for gardening and showed her the community's impressive raised beds. We'd listed the house with a real estate agent friend of mine who specialized in older homes with character issues, as she diplomatically called them. She'd recommended some minor cosmetic improvements to maximize the selling price: fresh paint in the main rooms, updated light fixtures, basic landscaping to improve curb appeal. I fronted the money for these repairs, adding it to my investment ledger. Kyle had taken charge of evaluating the business inventory and developing a plan for the online transition, occasionally sending me excited texts about vendors he'd found for website development and digital marketing. Dad, to my surprise, had begun spending afternoons at the store with him, asking questions and even offering suggestions that acknowledged the need for change. Progress was happening. Not smoothly, not without setbacks and moments of tension, but it was real progress nonetheless. And then came the call that threatened to unravel everything. I was at work, reviewing final plans for the sustainable apartment complex, when my phone rang. Kyle's name flashed on the screen. "Hey, what's up?" I answered, sandwiching the phone between my ear and shoulder as I continued making notes on the blueprint in front of me. "Jess?" His voice was tight with tension. "We have a problem." I set down my pen, suddenly alert. "What happened?" "It's Dad. He's refusing to sign the listing agreement for the house." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. "What exactly did he say?" "That he's had second thoughts. That maybe we could still save the business if we just had more time. That selling the house feels like giving up." Kyle's frustration was palpable through the phone. He kept saying he needed to talk to some other financial advisors, get a second opinion. The familiar knot of tension returned to my stomach. Let me guess. He mentioned Uncle Frank? Uncle Frank wasn't actually our uncle, but my father's oldest, friend from high school. He was a semi-retired financial planner with outdated ideas and an enabling personality who always told my father exactly what he wanted to hear. "Yeah," Kyle confirmed grimly. "He said Uncle Frank thinks refinancing might still be an option." I pinched the bridge of my nose, fighting back frustration. "Did he say this in front of Mom?" "No, she was at her doctor's appointment. That's why. I'm calling now before she gets back and he convinces her too." Smart, I thought. Kyle was finally learning to navigate Dad's manipulative tendencies. "I'll be there in an hour," I said, already gathering my things. "Stall him if you can. Don't let him call Uncle Frank until I get there." After a quick explanation to my boss, I was in my car heading toward Beaverton, my mind racing. This was the test I'd been half expecting. The moment when my father's pride reasserted itself, when the reality of change became too threatening, and he retreated to comfortable denial. Part of me, the hurt 18-year-old who still lived somewhere in my heart, wanted to wash my hands of the whole situation. Let them lose the house. Let them face the consequences of stubborn pride. I'd tried to help, and they'd rejected it. Again. But the adult I'd become knew better. This wasn't about keeping score or proving points. It was about breaking destructive patterns that had damaged our family for generations. I called Michael on the way, needing his steady perspective. "It's a defense mechanism," he said, after I explained the situation. "Your dad's making progress, facing hard truths, but it's overwhelming. So he's retreating to what feels safe, denial, and the illusion of control." "So what do I do?" I asked, switching lanes to pass a slow-moving truck. "I can't force him to sign the papers." "No, but you can try to understand the fear behind his resistance," Michael suggested. "What's he really afraid of losing? Because I don't think it's just the house." Michael's insight stuck with me as I pulled into my parents' driveway 30 minutes later. Dad's old pickup truck was there, but Mom's sedan was still gone. I found him alone in the garage, methodically organizing tools that had accumulated over decades. This had always been his retreat when stressed, sorting, cleaning, creating order in his physical space when his inner world felt chaotic. He looked up when I entered, unsurprised. "Kyle called you." It wasn't a question, so I didn't treat it like one. "You're having second thoughts." Dad turned back to his workbench. "I'm exploring all our options. That's what a responsible head of household does." The outdated phrase, head of household, struck me as both telling and sad. That role, as he understood it, was disappearing along with the house and business. "Dad," I said carefully, "we've been through all the options, multiple times, with actual financial experts. There isn't some magical solution we've overlooked. Frank tells you what you want to hear," I interrupted, more sharply than I intended. I took a breath, steadying myself. "Sorry, but you know it's true. He's not objective about this." Dad picked up a wrench, turning it over in his hands as if examining it for flaws. "This was my father's," he said abruptly. "He taught me how to change the oil in his old Chevy with this wrench. I was 10. The sudden shift caught me off guard. "It's a good wrench," I said, for lack of a better response. "He left me his tools when he died," Dad continued, his voice distant. "Said tools were meant to be used to build things, fix things, that a man who could use his tools never had to depend on others." Understanding began to dawn. This wasn't just about the house or even the business. It was about identity, about worth. "Is that what this is about?" I asked gently. "Depending on others? On me?" Dad's shoulders stiffened. "I'm 70 years old, Jessica. I've never taken a handout in my life. I've never failed to provide for my family." "This isn't a handout," I said, moving closer. "It's an investment, a restructuring, like any other business decision." "It's my daughter bailing me out because I failed," he countered, setting the wrench down with deliberate care. "It's admitting that everything I built wasn't sustainable, that I couldn't adapt. Like you said." There it was, the raw fear beneath the bluster. Not just financial failure, but personal failure. The failure of the story he'd told himself about who he was and what made him valuable. "Dad," I said quietly, "do you remember when I was about 6 and I tried to build that birdhouse by myself?" He glanced at me, a question in his eyes. "I was so determined to do it alone," I continued. "I refused all help, even when I was obviously struggling. And I ended up with a lopsided mess that no bird would ever use." A reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You were always stubborn." "Wonder where I got that from," I replied, and his smile widened fractionally. "But do you remember what you told me when I finally broke down crying about my failed birdhouse?" He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I said that asking for help wasn't weakness, that even master carpenters had apprentices and partners. And then you helped me fix it," I finished. "We rebuilt it together, and you let me take all the credit when Mom praised how nice it looked." Dad picked up another tool, a small hammer with a worn handle, and examined it with uncommon intensity. "That was different. You were a child learning. And none of us ever stop learning, Dad. The world keeps changing, and we have to change with it. That's not failure. It's wisdom." He didn't respond, but I could see my words landing somewhere behind his defenses. I decided to try a different approach. "What did Grandpa Morgan do before he started the home goods store?" I asked. Dad looked surprised by the question. "He was a factory worker at the paper mill until it closed in the recession. And then he had to reinvent himself, right? Something new?" Dad nodded slowly. "He was 45 years old, with 3 kids to feed. Started selling household items at the flea market, then rented that small storefront downtown." "So he adapted," I pointed out. "When circumstances changed, he found a new path. And that's exactly what we're trying to do now. Honor his legacy of resilience, not just cling to the specific business he created in a different era." Dad was silent for a long moment, turning the hammer over and over in his hands. "Your grandfather would have liked you," he finally said. "He respected people who spoke their minds." I smiled, hearing the unspoken acknowledgement in his words. "I wish I could have known him better." "He died too young," Dad agreed. "Heart attack at 62. Always worked too hard, worried too much." The mention of heart attacks reminded me of Dad's own health issues. And you're following right in his footsteps with that, aren't you? I said quietly. The stress of trying to save a sinking business isn't good for your heart, Dad. You know that. He sighed heavily, finally setting down the hammer. Patricia's been saying the same thing. Mom's worried about you. We all are. The garage door opener suddenly hummed to life, and we both turned to see Mom's sedan pulling in beside us. Perfect timing. She looked surprised to see me as she got out of the car. Jessica, I didn't know you were coming by today. Impromptu visit, I said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. How was your doctor's appointment? Fine, she said, a little too quickly. Just a regular checkup. Something in her tone made me look at her more closely. There were worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during our last meeting. Dad had noticed too. Patricia? What did Dr. Winters say? Mom hesitated, glancing between us. It's nothing serious, just some elevated blood pressure. He wants me to reduce stress and come back in 2 weeks. Dad's face darkened with concern. You never told me you were having blood pressure issues. Because you have enough to worry about, she replied, her tone gentle but firm. And it's manageable, with some lifestyle changes. The implication hung in the air, unmistakable. The current situation, the financial stress, the uncertainty about their future was affecting her health too. Dad looked stricken. For all his stubborn pride, I knew he loved Mom deeply. The thought of his actions harming her health would hit him harder than any financial argument I could make. Robert, Mom said, taking his hand. Dr. Winters asked about our housing situation. I told him we were planning to move to that lovely senior community Jessica showed us. He thought it was an excellent idea. Less maintenance, less worry. Dad's jaw worked silently for a moment. You told him we'd decided? I told him we were strongly considering it, she corrected gently. Which we are, aren't we? For our health, our future, our peace of mind? I watched this exchange with a mixture of admiration and concern. Mom was using her health as leverage, a strategy that part of me found manipulative, yet another part recognized as perhaps necessary given the stakes. Kyle said you're having second thoughts about selling the house, I said, deciding to tackle the issue directly. Dad shot me a look that might have been irritation or resignation, I couldn't tell which. I was exploring alternatives. Like, calling Frank Anderson for another refinancing scheme that won't work? Mom asked, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. Robert, we've been down that road. All it's done is dig us deeper into debt and stress. Dad seemed taken aback by her directness. I'm just making sure we're not rushing into anything, Patricia. And I'm making sure we don't miss our chance at a fresh start because you're too proud to accept reality, she countered. I'm tired, Robert. Tired of lying awake at night worrying about money. Tired of watching you work yourself to exhaustion for a business that's draining us dry. And I'm especially tired of pretending that everything's fine when it's not. The raw honesty in her voice silenced both of us. Mom had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over and kept the family functioning. To hear her speak so bluntly about her own limits was jarring and powerful. Dad reached out to take her hand, his expression softening. I didn't realize it was affecting you this much. Of course it is, she said, squeezing his hand. We've been married for 35 years. Your stress is my stress. I felt like I was witnessing something private, a shift in my parents' relationship, dynamic that had perhaps been building for years. Mom was finally asserting her own needs, her own voice, and Dad, surprisingly, was listening. The blood pressure, he said quietly. Is it serious? Mom's expression gentled. It's a warning. Sign, Robert. One we should heed. She glanced at me, then back to him. Jessica's plan is a good one. It gives us a fresh start, free from debt, in a place that will be easier to manage as we get older. And it gives us a chance to heal our family, to be part of our daughter's life again, to know our grandchildren. I blinked in surprise. Grandchildren? Mom smiled. Well, not yet. But someday, perhaps, with you and Michael. The casual mention of a future I hadn't even discussed with my parents, marriage, children, was oddly touching. Mom was already placing me back in the family narrative, imagining a future where our relationships were restored. Dad was watching me, something unreadable in his expression. This plan of yours, he said slowly. The senior living place. It really has a woodworking shop? I nodded. A good one. I checked. Professional grade tools, plenty of space. Some of the residents are apparently quite skilled. One of them used to be a furniture maker. He seemed to be turning something over in his mind. And the online business idea. Kyle's pretty excited about it. He is, I confirmed. He's got some good ideas for modernizing while keeping the core products that have always sold well. Dad looked around the garage, at the tools he'd accumulated over decades, at the workbench where he'd taught both Kyle and me basic carpentry skills when we were children. Most of these wouldn't fit in a smaller place, he said, more to himself than to us. No, I agreed gently, but the important ones would, and the wood shop would have everything else you might need. He nodded slowly, then looked at Mom. Your blood pressure, we need to get that under control. Yes, she said simply, we do. And the stress of all this, he gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the business, the financial precarity they'd been living with. It's not helping, she finished for him. Dad was quiet for a long moment, then he straightened his shoulders. All right, he said firmly. We'll sign the listing agreement today, and I'll call the bank in the morning, tell them we have a plan to settle the arrears. Mom's face lit up with relief. Really? You're sure? I'm sure, he said, though I could still see the strain it cost him to say it. Jessica's right. It's time to adapt, to find a new path. He looked at me, a hint of his old determination in his eyes. But I want to be clear about something. This investment of yours. I intend to pay you back. Every penny. I started to object, to explain again that this was a business arrangement, not a loan. But something in his expression stopped me. This was important to him, to his sense of dignity, to his identity as a provider. We'll work out the details, I said instead. The important thing is getting the house on the market quickly. The real estate agent thinks it could sell within a month if we price it right. Dad nodded, decision made. Let's go inside. Call? Kyle, tell him to bring over those papers. As we headed back into the house, I felt a tentative optimism. We'd overcome a significant hurdle. Dad's instinctive retreat to denial when faced with change. It wasn't the end of our challenges, not by a long shot, but it was progress. Kyle arrived 20 minutes later with the listing agreement, trying and failing to hide his relief when Dad signed it without further argument. We spent the next hour discussing next steps, the timeline for house showings, the inventory assessment at the store, the deposit required to secure a unit at the senior living community. Throughout the conversation, I kept waiting for Dad to backtrack, to insert new conditions, or raise new objections. But he remained committed, if subdued, asking practical questions and even making occasional notes on a legal pad. As evening approached, Kyle headed home to have dinner with Vanessa and the kids. I was preparing to leave as well when Dad asked me to stay a bit longer. There's something I'd like to show you, he said, leading the way upstairs. Mom gave me a puzzled look. Clearly, she didn't know what this was about either, but smiled encouragingly as I followed him. Dad led me not to my old bedroom, but to the small office adjacent to the master bedroom. It had always been his private domain, where he did the books for the business and kept important family documents. The room was cluttered but organized in its own way, with filing cabinets against one wall and a desk piled with papers. Dad went to one of the cabinets, pulled out a key from his pocket, and unlocked the bottom drawer. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, rummaging through the drawer. About legacies, about what we pass down to the next generation. He pulled out a thick manila envelope, aged and slightly yellowed around the edges. Your grandfather left this for me when he died. I've never shown it to anyone, not even your mother. Intrigued, I watched as he carefully opened the envelope and removed a stack of papers, some typed, some handwritten on lined paper in a strong, angular script I didn't recognize. What is this? I asked as he handed me the stack. My father's journals, Dad said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, and his business records from the early days. The struggle to get Morgan Home Goods off the ground after the mill closed. I looked down at the top page, a handwritten entry dated April 18th, 1973. Read it, Dad encouraged. The first few pages, at least. I began to read, immediately drawn into my grandfather's straightforward prose. Laid off today after 16 years at the mill. Not unexpected, given the rumors these past months, but a blow nonetheless. Marion trying to be strong for the children, but I saw her crying in the kitchen when she thought I was out in the garage. Need to find something quickly. 3 growing children don't feed themselves. Robert at 15 needs new shoes already again. The factory in Gresham isn't hiring. We'll try the shipping company tomorrow. I looked up at Dad, moved by this intimate glimpse into a family history I'd barely known. I didn't realize he kept journals. Dad nodded. Every day for most of his adult life. Keep reading. I turned to the next entry, dated 3 days later. No luck at the shipping company, or the warehouse, or the construction site. Beginning. To understand that at 45, with no college education and no specialized skills beyond what I learned at the mill, I'm not exactly a prime candidate. Marion suggested selling some of her handmade items at the Sunday market. Quilts, embroidered, linens, that sort of thing. Hated the idea at first. A Morgan man provides for his family, doesn't depend on his wife's hobbies, but pride doesn't put food on the table. We'll help her set up a stall this weekend. Robert furious when I asked him to assist instead of going fishing with his friends. That boy has too much of my stubborn pride already. Need to teach him flexibility before life forces the lesson more harshly. The words hit uncomfortably close to home. I glanced at Dad, wondering if he saw the parallel to our own situation as clearly as I did. My father was a stubborn man, Dad said, answering my unspoken question. Proud, hardworking, determined to do things his way. Sound familiar? I nodded, unsure where this was heading. Keep going, he encouraged. Skip ahead to June 12th. It's marked with a red tab. I flipped through the pages until I found the indicated entry. Marion's linens sold well again, as did the handmade wooden trays and kitchen items I've been making in the garage. 3rd straight week of profit. Small, but steady. Robert helping reluctantly, but effectively. The boy has a good eye for what will sell, better than mine if I'm honest. Thinking of expanding beyond the Sunday market. Leasing that empty storefront on Maple would be a risk, but a calculated one. Had a long talk with Henry Collins at the bank today. He's willing to extend a small business loan based on our market success and a solid business plan. Marion excited, full of ideas for inventory and display. Finding myself excited too, despite the fear. Perhaps losing the mill job was a blessing in disguise, forcing me to find a new path I would never have chosen voluntarily. Still don't know if this will work long term, but for the first time in months, I feel hopeful. Sometimes survival requires reinvention. The last line resonated deeply. Sometimes survival requires reinvention. My grandfather's words from nearly 50 years ago speaking directly to our current situation. He started the business out of necessity, I said, looking up from the journal. Not because it was his dream or his passion? Dad nodded. It was survival, adaptation. And yes, eventually it became his pride and joy, but that came later. He took the journals back, handling. them with reverence. I read these again last night, after our talk in the garage. Realized I'd forgotten, or maybe never fully appreciated, how my father reinvented himself after the mill closed. How terrified he must have been. He carefully returned the journals to their envelope, then looked at me with new resolve. I've been so focused on preserving his legacy that I forgot the most important part of that legacy: his ability to change when circumstances demanded it, his pragmatism over pride. The admission clearly cost him something, but there was also a sense of relief in his voice, as if setting down a heavy burden he'd carried too long. "Thank you for showing me this," I said, genuinely moved by the gesture and what it represented. "It helps me understand a lot about our family, about you." Dad nodded, returning the envelope to its drawer. "I should have shared these with you and Kyle years ago. Maybe things would have been different." I wasn't sure how to respond to that counterfactual, how knowledge of my grandfather's journals might have changed the trajectory of our family, prevented the rupture when I chose architecture over the family business. It seemed pointless to speculate now. "We're finding our way back," I said instead. "That's what matters." Dad closed the drawer and locked it, pocketing the key. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "That's what matters now." As we headed back downstairs, I felt a shift in our relationship, subtle but significant. For perhaps the first time, Dad had shared something vulnerable with me, something that revealed his own struggles with legacy and identity. It wasn't a complete transformation. Decades of patterns don't change overnight. But it was a meaningful step toward a more authentic relationship. Mom was waiting in the living room, curiosity evident in her expression. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Dad assured her. "Just sharing some family history with Jessica." Mom seemed surprised but pleased. "Well, if you're both done with your secret meeting, I was thinking we might order dinner. Stay and eat with us, Jessica? It's getting late." The invitation was so normal, so ordinary, yet it represented something profound. The simple inclusion in family life that had been absent for a decade. "I'd like that," I said, pulling out my phone. "Let me just text Michael so he doesn't wait. Dinner for me." As I sent the message, I noticed Dad watching me, something unresolved in his expression. "This, Michael," he said abruptly. "You should bring him next time, for dinner, if he wants to come." The invitation was awkward, stilted, but unmistakably genuine. Another small step toward rebuilding. "I think he'd like that," I replied, matching Dad's attempt at casualness. "He's curious about you both." "We're curious about him too," Mom added, her smile warm. "Anyone who makes our Jessica happy is someone we want to know." The simple affirmation, "our Jessica," sent an unexpected wave of emotion through me. For so long, I had defined myself in opposition to my parents, as someone who had been rejected by them and had built a life despite that rejection. The idea of being claimed again, of being theirs, in a way that didn't deny my autonomy but acknowledged our connection, was both comforting and disorienting. "He makes me very happy," I confirmed, returning Mom's smile. "And he's been a big supporter of this whole reconciliation process." Dad nodded, absorbing this. "Good. That's good." He cleared his throat. "We'll order from that Thai place you used to like. If they're still in business." "They are," I confirmed. "I drive by, sometimes on my way to projects in this area." The small revelation that I had occasionally come near my childhood home over the years, thinking of them even during our estrangement, seemed to affect both my parents. Mom's eyes grew misty, and Dad looked away quickly, blinking more than necessary. "I'll call the order in," he said gruffly, heading to the kitchen where they kept takeout menus in a drawer. Mom watched him go, then turned to me. "He's really trying, Jessica. This is hard for him. All of it. The business, the house, reconnecting with you. But he's trying. I know, I said softly. And I appreciate it. I'm trying too. She reached over to squeeze my hand. That's all any of us can do, isn't it? Try our best, day by day, to heal what's been broken. As we sat down to dinner 20 minutes later, the conversation flowed more easily than I would have expected. We talked about neutral topics at first: neighborhood changes, Kyle's children, a recent exhibit at the Portland Art Museum that both Mom and I had attended separately. Gradually, cautiously, we began to fill in the gaps of the past decade. I told them about my first apartment, the challenges of juggling multiple jobs while maintaining my scholarship, the professors who had mentored me, my early career milestones. They shared updates on extended family members, community changes, health issues they'd faced and overcome. We carefully avoided the most painful topics: the immediate aftermath of my departure, holidays spent apart, major life events missed. Those conversations would come later, I sensed, when our fragile new connection was stronger, better able to bear the weight of unresolved grief. As I helped Mom clear the table after dinner, Dad disappeared briefly, returning with an envelope. "Before you go," he said, handing it to me, "I want you to have this." Inside was a check for $5,000, a significant sum for them, especially given their financial situation. "Dad, what is this?" I asked, confused. "The first installment," he said firmly, "on paying you back for the repairs to get the house ready for sale." I started to protest, to remind him that those costs were part of my investment in the overall plan, but he held up a hand to stop me. "This is important to me, Jessica. I know we have a long-term financial arrangement for the bigger picture, but these immediate expenses, I want to cover them myself from the business's remaining cash reserves." I looked at the check, understanding what it represented to him. Not just money, but agency. Control over at least one aspect of a situation where he'd been forced to concede so much. "Okay," I said, tucking the check into my purse. "Thank you." He nodded, seeming relieved by my acceptance. "The real estate agent thinks we'll have offers by the end of the month?" "That's her estimate," I confirmed. "The market is strong, right? Now." "Then we should start seriously looking at those senior places," he said, surprising me with his proactive approach. "Figure out which one we want before the house sells. Make sure they have a unit available when we need it. I can set up appointments for next week," I offered. "Take you for follow-up tours, talk to the management about availability and timelines." "Do that," he agreed. "The sooner we have a clear plan, the better." His decisive tone, the familiar, take-charge attitude that had characterized his approach to business for decades, was oddly reassuring. Dad was finding his way back to himself, not by clinging to the past, but by applying his strengths to our new reality. As I gathered my things to leave, he surprised me again by pulling me into an awkward but heartfelt hug. "Drive safely," he said gruffly. "Text when you get home so we know you arrived." Such a normal parental request, the kind I might have rolled my eyes at as a teenager but now found unexpectedly moving. "I will," I promised, returning the hug. On the drive back to Portland, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, not because all our problems were solved, far from it. We still had a house to sell, a business to close, a move to manage, and years of emotional distance to navigate. But for the first time, I truly believed we might succeed, that we might find our way back to being a family, different from before, but perhaps stronger for having been broken and mended. When I arrived home, Michael was waiting up, eager to hear how the day had gone. I told him everything: the initial standoff, Mom's blood pressure revelation, Dad's surprising vulnerability in sharing his father's journals, the dinner invitation that had included him. "Sounds like real progress," he said, clearly pleased. "The journals especially. That's a big deal, Jess. Him sharing something that personal, that meaningful." I nodded, leaning against him on the couch. "It feels like we're turning a corner." Like maybe we can actually do this. Rebuild something worth having. I never doubted it, Michael said, kissing the top of my head. You're all stubborn as hell, but you're also capable of tremendous growth when you decide to make it happen. I laughed, recognizing the truth in his assessment. Apparently, it runs in the family, through the generations. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I found myself thinking about my grandfather's journal entry. Sometimes survival requires reinvention. We were all reinventing ourselves in a way. Me as a daughter who could maintain boundaries while rebuilding bridges, Mom as a wife who could assert her own needs while supporting her husband, Dad as a man who could find worth beyond the business. He'd built. It wouldn't be easy. Old patterns would resurface. New challenges would emerge. But together, perhaps we could create a new chapter in the Morgan family story. One defined not by rigid expectations and conditional love, but by acceptance, adaptation, and genuine connection. 6 months after my parents moved into Willow Ridge, I found myself walking through an empty Victorian house in Northeast Portland, measuring tape in hand, Michael following behind with a notepad. The wooden floors creaked beneath our feet, telling stories of the families who had lived here since it was built in 1908. Sunlight streamed through bay windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and highlighting both the home's potential and its need for considerable updating. "What do you think?" our real estate agent Tara asked, watching as I ran my hand along the original crown molding. "It needs work, but all the character is intact." "The foundation is solid," I noted, impressed despite myself. "The bones are good, really good." Michael raised an eyebrow. "But that kitchen is straight out of 1975, and not in a charming way." "Complete gut job," I agreed. "Bathrooms too. But the layout is fantastic, and these built-ins are original." We continued our tour. My professional eye cataloging needed repairs while my personal vision saw what this house could become. A home for us, a place to build our future together, a place where perhaps we might someday raise children who would never know what it meant to be rejected for following their dreams. "The asking price leaves room for renovations," Tara reminded us. "And with your expertise, Jessica, you could manage the project more efficiently than most buyers." She was right. My promotion at Horizon had come with not just increased responsibility and salary, but also the respect and flexibility that allowed me to consider taking on a personal renovation project. It wouldn't be easy, balancing the affordable housing development I was leading with remodeling a century-old house, but the challenge excited me. "What's your professional assessment?" Michael asked as we examined the master bedroom with its oddly placed closets and outdated ensuite bathroom. "It's a 7-month project minimum," I replied honestly, "but potentially transformative. The location is perfect, the square footage works for long-term growth, and the architectural details are irreplaceable." He squeezed my hand. "And your non-professional assessment?" I looked around the room again, seeing beyond its current state to what it could be. "I think it feels right. Like..." I hesitated, searching for the words. "Like a place that could become ours in a way our apartment never quite has." We spent another half-hour exploring, checking plumbing access points, examining the electrical panel, peering into the attic. By the time we descended the front steps back to the street, I knew we were both thinking the same thing. "We'd like to make an offer," Michael told Tara, who barely contained her excitement. "I'll draw up the paperwork." "This afternoon," she promised. "Given the condition, I think we can come in under asking and still be competitive." As we drove away, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and anxiety. This would be the largest financial commitment of our lives so far, committing us not just to a mortgage, but to each other in a new way. It felt significant and right, this step, forward together. "We should celebrate," Michael suggested. "Early dinner before we head to your parents'?" It was Wednesday, our standing dinner date at Willow Ridge. What had begun as an occasional visit had evolved into a weekly ritual, a Way of maintaining our reconnection through regular, ordinary time together. Perfect, I agreed. There's that new place on Alberta Street we've been wanting to try. Over small plates and craft cocktails, we discussed renovation plans, budget considerations, and timeline projections. The conversation felt natural and exciting. Two people building a shared vision, each bringing their strengths to the partnership. Speaking of major life decisions, Michael said, setting down his fork with an air of deliberate casualness that immediately caught my attention. I've been thinking about something else too. My heart skipped a beat. Oh? He reached across the table to take my hand. These past few months, watching you rebuild your relationship with your parents, seeing how you've navigated such a complex situation with grace and strength, it's only made me more certain about us. I felt my cheeks warm, not just from the cocktail. Certain about what exactly? That you're the person I want to build a life with, renovate old houses with, grow old with. His eyes held mine, serious and sincere. I was thinking, maybe this summer, we could make it official. Michael Chen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotions swelling in my chest. Are you proposing to me in a tapas restaurant? He laughed, relieving some of the tension. Not exactly. I wouldn't deprive you of a proper proposal with a ring and all the traditional elements. Consider this a pre-proposal discussion, testing the waters. The waters are warm, I assured him, squeezing his hand. Whenever you decide to take the plunge. His smile was bright enough to light the room. Good to know. By the time we arrived at Willow Ridge, I was floating on a cloud of happiness. The house, the implicit engagement, the sense that my life was coming together in ways I couldn't have imagined a year ago. The transformation in my parents' lives was equally remarkable. Their apartment had quickly become a home, filled with carefully chosen mementos and new touches that reflected this chapter of their lives. Mom had joined not just the gardening club, but also a book group and a weekly water aerobics class. Her blood pressure had normalized without medication, a development her doctor attributed directly to reduced stress. Dad, to everyone's surprise, had thrown himself into community life with unexpected enthusiasm. The woodworking shop had become his second home, where he spent most mornings working on increasingly ambitious projects. He'd even been elected to the residence council, where his business experience and practical problem-solving were apparently highly valued. There they are, Mom called as we entered, coming forward to embrace us both. She looked younger somehow, the worry lines that had etched her face for years softened by contentment and adequate sleep. Dad was setting the table, an ordinary domestic task I'd rarely seen him perform in the old house. Just in time, he greeted us. Chicken's almost done. The small dining area was crowded with the table that had once dominated their formal dining room, but the intimacy suited our revitalized relationships. Family pictures adorned the walls, including several recent ones of all of us together, visual evidence of our healing. Something smells amazing, Michael commented as we took our seats. New recipe, Mom explained proudly. From my cooking class. The chef who teaches it used to work at that fancy restaurant downtown. Another surprise of Willow Ridge, the continuing education and enrichment programs that had opened new worlds for both my parents. Mom, who had always enjoyed cooking but stuck to familiar recipes, was now experimenting with techniques and ingredients she'd never considered before. How's the online store doing? I asked Dad as Mom brought dishes to the table. His face brightened. Had our best month yet. That feature in the home design blog Kyle arranged really paid off. Orders up 30%. We've been experimenting with some new vendor relationships too, Mom added. Artisans from the Pacific Northwest, sustainability-focused products. Kyle says it's important to have a clear brand identity in the digital marketplace. The ease with which they discussed the business's evolution, this new incarnation that bore little resemblance to the struggling store that had nearly bankrupted them, never ceased to amaze me. What had initially been viewed as a devastating loss had transformed into an opportunity for growth and innovation. "And how are you two?" Mom asked, passing the salad. "Any news to share?" Michael caught my eye, a silent question. I gave a small nod. They were family now, part of our lives in a way that felt genuine and right. They deserved to share in our joy. "Actually, we've had a big day," he began, then told them about the Victorian house, our renovation plans, and, with a slightly nervous glance at my father, our tentative engagement discussions. Mom's face lit up with delight. "Oh, how wonderful! Both things! A house and a wedding to plan!" Dad's reaction was more measured but no less genuine. "That's quite a commitment. The house and the, other commitment. You're sure you're ready for all that?" A year ago, I might have interpreted his question as doubt or criticism. Now I recognized it as sincere concern for our well-being, an appropriate parental response to significant life decisions. "We are," I affirmed. "The house needs work, but that's reflected in the price. And as for the other commitment," I exchanged smiles with Michael. "That one's been in process for a while." Dad nodded, raising his water glass. "Well then, congratulations are in order. To new beginnings, on all fronts." We clinked glasses, the simple toast carrying layers of meaning beyond. The immediate celebration, new beginnings indeed, in housing, in relationships, in our understanding of what family could mean. As dinner progressed, conversation flowed easily between topics. Dad's latest woodworking project, a jewelry box for Mom's birthday, the community, garden plot Mom had been assigned for spring planting, Michael's work developing educational software, my affordable housing project's progress. "Actually," Dad said during a lull, "I've been meaning to ask you something about that project of yours, Jessica." "The affordable housing development?" I asked, curious about his interest. He nodded. "I remember you mentioned sustainable materials being a priority. Got me thinking about those bamboo cutting boards and utensils we used to carry at the store. Sustainable, durable, reasonably priced. Wondering if there might be applications for similar materials in your construction." The question surprised me. Not just the thoughtful connection between his retail experience and my architectural work, but the genuine interest in what I was creating. "There might be," I acknowledged. "We're definitely looking at alternative materials for countertops and flooring. Cost is a factor, of course, but life cycle analysis often shows sustainable options being more economical long-term. I've still got contacts in that supply chain," he offered, almost hesitantly, "if it would be helpful." The offer touched me deeply, a bridging of our professional worlds that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "That would be great, actually. Our materials consultant is putting together options next week. Maybe you could join that meeting?" Dad looked both surprised and pleased by the invitation. "I'd like that. Been a while since I've been in a business meeting. Might be fun to keep my hand in, so to speak." Mom beamed at this exchange, clearly delighted by this new dimension of our reconnection. After dinner, as Michael helped Mom with dishes, insisting despite her protests that guests could certainly help clean up, Dad gestured for me to follow him into the spare bedroom they'd set up as a small study. "Got something to show you," he said, opening the closet door to reveal a large object covered with a sheet. "Been working on this for a while now." He pulled away the sheet to expose a beautifully crafted dollhouse. Not the one from my childhood, but a new creation. More sophisticated in design, but clearly inspired by that earlier project. "Dad," I breathed, taking in the intricate details. "This is incredible." "Still needs some finishing touches," he said modestly, though I could see the pride in his eyes. "Thought it might be something for that future grandchild we've been dancing around discussing. Or just a nice piece for your new house if you want it." I ran my fingers along the tiny shingles, the perfectly scaled windows, the miniature porch swing that actually moved. "It's beautiful, truly museum quality." I looked up at him. Thank you. He nodded, a slight flush coloring his cheeks at the praise. Been good therapy, working on it. Gives my hands something to do while my mind sorts things out. Sorts what? Things out? I asked gently. He was quiet for a moment, adjusting a tiny piece of trim that didn't need adjusting. The past, mistakes, regrets. His eyes met mine briefly, then returned to the dollhouse. How to do better going forward. The vulnerability in his admission moved me. This was so far from the unyielding patriarch who had once ruled our family that it almost felt like speaking with a different person. Yet the core of him, the craftsmanship, the attention to detail, the desire to create something lasting, remained unchanged. You are doing better, I told him honestly. We all are. He nodded, accepting this assessment. Your mother says, I should try therapy, real therapy, not just woodworking. They have a counselor here who specializes in family reconciliation. This was unexpected. My father had always dismissed therapy as something for weak people who can't solve their own problems. That he was even considering it represented a seismic shift in his worldview. What do you think about that idea? I asked carefully. He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. I think there's more to unpack than I can manage on my own. Things from my own childhood, patterns I repeated without understanding why. He looked at me directly. I don't want to waste any more time being the man I was. Life's too short, and I've already missed too much. I reached out and squeezed his arm, words momentarily beyond me. The acknowledgement of his desire to change, to grow even at 70, was perhaps the greatest gift he could offer. Greater even than the exquisite dollhouse or his business contacts or his tentative blessing of my future marriage. I think it's a great idea, I finally managed. And brave. He snorted softly at that. Not brave. Necessary. Should have done it 30 years ago. Might have saved us all a lot of pain. Well, as someone wise recently told me, I said with a small smile, better late than never. He recognized his own words reflected back to him and chuckled. Touché? When we rejoined Mom and Michael in the living room, they were deep in conversation. About wedding possibilities, venue options, seasonal considerations, family traditions worth preserving, and others better left behind. Don't let her overwhelm you, Dad warned Michael good-naturedly. Patricia's been mentally planning Jessica's wedding since she was about 5 years old. Not true, Mom protested, though her sheepish smile suggested otherwise. I'm just excited, and I want to be helpful, not intrusive. She looked at me anxiously. I am being helpful, not intrusive, right? The concern in her voice, this new awareness of boundaries, this desire to support without controlling, was evidence of her own growth. You're being exactly right, I assured her. And we welcome your input. Just remember it's early days yet. Of course, she agreed quickly. No pressure, just ideas to consider. As the evening wound down, conversation shifted to plans for the coming weekend. Kyle and his family were visiting on Saturday for a community concert in the Willow Ridge Gardens. You should join us, Mom suggested. They're setting up picnic tables and residents can invite family. Should be lovely if the weather holds. We'd love to, Michael responded, checking with me for confirmation. Assuming our offer on the house doesn't require immediate attention. Even if it does, we'll make it work, I assured them. Family time is important. The phrase slipped out naturally, without irony or bitterness. Family time is important. Once a loaded concept used to manipulate and control, now reclaimed as something genuine and nurturing. As we prepared to leave, Dad surprised us both with proper hugs, still somewhat awkward but increasingly natural with practice. Drive safely, he instructed as always. And Jessica, I'll email you about that materials meeting. Looking forward to it. Me too, I said, and meant it. This new dimension to our relationship, professional adults with mutual respect for each other's expertise, was unexpected and deeply satisfying. On the drive home, Michael and I were quiet at first, processing the evening in comfortable silence. "Your dad seemed different tonight," he eventually observed. "More open." I nodded, thinking about the dollhouse, the therapy discussion, the genuine interest in my work. "He's really trying. They both are." "It's working," Michael said simply. "Whatever this new version of family is that you're all creating, it's working." He was right. We were creating something new together, not a return to the past, which would have been neither possible nor desirable, but a fresh construction built on stronger foundations. Like the Victorian house we hoped to renovate, we were preserving what was valuable while making necessary changes for a healthier future. Later that night, as I drifted toward sleep, my thoughts returned to the dollhouse. Not just the exquisite craftsmanship, but what it represented. A legacy passed down, not with strings attached, but as a gift freely given. A connection across generations that honored the past while embracing the future. My father's hands had created it, the same hands that had once packed my belongings into my car when I was 18. The same hands that had signed mortgage documents putting the family home at risk to save a failing business. The same hands that had eventually signed the listing agreement to sell that home. The papers for the Willow Ridge apartment. The operating agreement for the new online version of Morgan Home Goods. Hands capable of destruction and creation, of pushing away and drawing near. Just like all of us. The thought stayed with me as I fell asleep. This awareness of our human complexity, our capacity for both harm and healing. None of us were simply heroes or villains in this family story. We were all flawed, all learning, all worthy of the second chances we were giving each other. Family comes first. The phrase that had once been a weapon was being transformed into a promise, not of blind loyalty or conformity, but of authentic care and mutual growth. A commitment to keep trying, to keep building, to keep loving, even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. And in that transformative promise, I found a piece I had never expected to know. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.
Just click and check them out!